The NBA Finals are here, and we need to bring in the big guns to break it all down as the NBA season comes to a close. And what does that mean? The professor is in town. This is Basketball U. What's up, everyone? Welcome to the first ever installment of Basketball U. The class is in session, and we are here as a part of the INC Sports Paradigm, all those sub-shows that we talked about a couple of months ago. This is finally the basketball NBA-centric version of this coming to fruition, and we have here who I consider the preeminent professor of basketball, Matthew Humphreys. Matthew, welcome to the INC Sports Paradigm, my friend. You've been here before, but we are here now to talk about your specialty, the NBA. How you doing, buddy?
Love it. Happy to be here. Love talking some basketball.
Oh, you do love talking some basketball. And I have to admit, you are one of the people that I've met who I feel like knows more about the sport that they're passionate about than anybody that I've ever met. And that's not me trying to set the audience up for anything. It's genuinely true. You pull out facts, you pull out narrative stories. And it's funny, I've been watching Winning Time, and all the stuff that you talk about is in this particular documentary, docu-series. It's not even really a documentary. It's creative, but all the stuff that's in there makes me laugh because you've talked about it before on air and off air. So I'm really excited to have you here, and I know that you are excited because there's a lot to talk about right now in the NBA.
Absolutely. I've been watching basketball for so long. I'm as old as the Magic, which is where I'm from. I'm from Orlando. I'm wearing a Magic hat for the listeners who can't see me, but I've been a Magic fan for as long as I can remember. My earliest memories of the team were the Shaq and Penny '95 Magic. So I'm going back. I stick with them still. I remember the McGrady years. I remember the Howard years, and I'm here for the current, present, and future of where we're going with Banchero. I've been a fan. I started really digging into NBA history probably around when the NBA had their 50th anniversary in the late '90s. I think it was '97, and they came out with this VHS NBA at 50 that was hosted by Denzel Washington. Do you remember that?
I actually do not.
I think you can find it on YouTube, like a pretty bad quality of it on YouTube, but I still have that VHS hiding somewhere. But that VHS just, I think I tore up that video over a summer and just absorbed all of it. And I was so fascinated by all the stories of like the history of the NBA and kind of the very interesting journey that the NBA had to that point. And I've followed it ever since.
And you played, right?
I did. I played through high school. I played competitively. I don't play competitively anymore, though I do appreciate going out to a shooter's paradise and just letting it go for a little while.
And for the viewer and listeners' edification, that means inviting me and our boy Cleve out so that he can outshoot us and feel good about himself the rest of the day, which has happened on a couple of occasions. Although I have to say, for a big fat white guy, I actually can hold my own out there not too bad. Considering how long it's been since I'm shot at that kind of volume, I'm not terrible.
It's always a fun point of conversation whenever somebody first meets me because I'm 6'3" in real life. So when people see me that's taller than most, they'll look at me, oh, did you play, or do you play basketball? And it's like, I used to. And I can translate that into a very natural conversation just because it's been such an integral part of my life pretty much throughout, and still is.
And you and I share something because even though there is somewhat of an age gap between the two of us, we grew up watching Michael Jordan in his prime, more specifically the three-peats, the dual three-peats that took place. And I think that with Michael Jordan's career, and this is not a tangent we're going to go off too much here, but I think a lot of people forget about how long he played in the league because I think when a lot of folks today remember Michael Jordan, we remember 91 through 98. And how could you not? I mean, 6 championships, no championship losses with a faux suspension in the middle of that. But Michael Jordan started playing in 1985? So he had been around a long time, and a lot of people forget about that. And so you and I share that. And I think sometimes when we talk about greats and we look at the players of yesteryear, we are skewed in the Michael Jordan part of it because we grew up watching him. And you, I believe, agree with me that a lot of that has to do with how you feel about these discussions about who's the greatest and who's not the greatest.
100%. And I've always been a proponent that greatness is greatness no matter the era. I think that if you want to make the discussion of what would happen if you put X player from the present into the past, and you make the vice versa discussion of the past, present to the future, you have to take into account the circumstances of the future and say, hey, that player would now have all these modern advantages that they didn't have then. But you also have to compare context of greatness to the time. How dominant were they to their time? Talent scales. Even though you can argue that players today are more skilled perhaps than the average player in 1950, and you'd be right, they are. It doesn't mean that someone like George Mikan, who was the preeminent superstar at the start of the NBA, would be any less dominant. The things that made him great then, if born, you know, 20 years ago in the NBA today, he would have the modern advantages of that. It still would make him great. It's the drive, it's the competitiveness, and the will to win, the will to be successful.
That's the part of the argument that I never feel like is accounted for is a lot of people want to take old players and put them in the league the way they were in the 1950s, 1960s. And a guy that I dog a lot is JJ Redick when he talks about how Bob Cousy played plumbers. Well, yes, maybe back in the day that is true. But if Bob Cousy was transported to today and everything that made Bob Cousy was put into a player today, he would dominate. No question.
Yeah, he would be. Uh, he reminded me of like Jason Kidd was Apex Bob Cousy to me, like the same style of like play, the same style of flashy pass, the same style of like I'm catching a ball and I'm starting my run on the fast break. It was almost the same. He was just doing it in 1950 as opposed to doing it in the mid 2000s when Jason Kidd was at his most dominant.
And
So like
it looked more natural in the 2000s than it did in the 1950s.
true, because he was the only one doing it. Whereas in the 2000s, by the time we got to Jason Kidd, we already saw Magic Johnson doing that for a decade, so it became normal.
Exactly. And so that brings us to where we are today. As we are recording this, the NBA finals start on June 1st, and we are getting Heat culture versus the Denver Nuggets. So there's a lot to unpack in that series, but I want to start with the series as a whole because one of the reasons I started this and I wanted you on board is to get those nuanced observations about the season, about the game, because you are a Magic fan, but I know that you follow the whole league intently and you have a lot of thoughts on things that took place. And it's a long season. 82 games is a lot of games and a lot happens. I mean, what happened in October, we kind of forget about that because where we are today, we're what, 7 games potentially away from the end of the season. So I wanted to give you the floor to give the listeners and viewers a little bit of an insight from your perspective on the 2023 season.
I feel like this year has been more competitive, involving more teams than in years past. Meaning, and I don't know if that's a result of the play-in tournament or the disincentivizing of lottery percentages in the draft lotto. I'm not sure if it's or a combination of both. Teams are trying harder later in the season because they have an opportunity to potentially get in the play-in game. The Miami Heat were literally the last team to qualify for the playoffs, and now they're in the NBA Finals. Jokes aside about Heat culture, there's something there. I'm sure we'll talk about it in a little bit, but like I think just in the microcosm of like the play-in tournament that it's a massive success as a incentivization for teams to not, again, as a Magic fan, the Magic were eliminated from the play-in tournament in game 78 of 82. Yeah, you could say it's a stretch, but it's true. In previous years, the Magic would have shut that down in game 60. Like, we've got no shot. Wembanyama's coming. Let's see if we can blow this thing up. We did it in essence last year to try and get the number one pick, which we got Bancaro. But so many more teams are more competitive, and I think that that's a great thing for the NBA. I think it's a great thing for basketball. I think it's creating better quality of game. Even though that I think that the NBA doesn't play defense anymore, which would be one of my other big takeaways from this season is that nobody plays defense except for apparently the Miami Heat are about the only team allowed to play defense in the NBA because we had so many. Like we talked about this on another pod, but like it blows my mind how many people scored north of 50 points in a game this season, especially in the 60s and 70s. Three guys, I think, scored in the 70s this year, right? Three people. And up until now, Wilt Chamberlain aside, there had only been like 6 people in the history of the game to do it, and then you had 3 more this year alone.
And
That's
that kind of
incredible.
and that kind of skews things too.
It skews a lot of stats. I mean, there will come a time too, assuming like I'm imagining that play-in games are considered playoff games. There'll come a time where it says, "Oh, so and so is the all-time like Luka Doncic is the all-time leading scorer in the playoffs." Well, because he played X number of playing games, he played all these playoff games, and now of course he's the leading scorer in the playoffs. So you'll always have some skewed stats. The three-point shot did that when it came into the NBA of skewing, saying, "Hey, like a guy like Kevin Durant takes and makes a lot of threes because he's quite good at it, is going to score more points than Jerry West ever did because Jerry West didn't have a three-point line."
And the same thing happened in football, where Troy Aikman's career touchdown stat is like less than Ryan Fitzpatrick, but that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that Ryan Fitzpatrick is a better quarterback than Troy Aikman. And I think that over time, these things are brought into the narrative. And right now, the way that I observe the NBA is that we are in this period of heightened scoring and no defense. And again, it is just the way that the game is. And it's going to come back to some kind of reality at some point because the type of players coming in are going to change, the skill set's going to change. And I feel like in every sport, there's going to be ebbs and flows on what matters. And I think that we will get back to those 84 to 79 finals games the way that we used to because I think it just is the way that it is. Like these things are circular, right? They're cyclical. And but I think it will be interesting to see what those games would look like with players that look the way they do today. Like imagine if everybody on those like 2004 Pistons teams looked the way that they do today and that team would be so beastly that it would become a new form of entertainment. But now we see three-pointers all over the place to the point last night the Boston Celtics were just like chuck and duck trying to win that series, right? And we'll get to that, but you made that observation offline, and that's kind of where we are. And it's a different game. It's a beautiful game in a lot of ways, the way that the fluidity of the game. But I think that there are some of the parts of it that are lost. Like I do miss seeing like a hard stop defense, like when you need that stop. And now it's like, well, let's just pray for a stop.
Yeah, I think that part of that too falls into the analytics, the rise of analytics over the last, 10, 20 years of the understanding that yes, a three-point shot is worth more than two. We get that. But some teams, and you mentioned the Celtics unloading threes as if they're the 2017 Warriors. The Celtics on average take more threes than twos in the course of a game. And that's purely analytics driven. Whether they have the team to do that or not is another thing. And that's why like watching teams like that are so like invested into analytics bother me to a degree. Like I appreciate the scoring, but like my God, take it to the basket, please. Like I dislike watching 15 straight possessions of just people chucking threes. It's not fun.
That has to be, in my opinion, like analytics in sports have become so much more prominent now. You see them in the NFL all the time. And I think in the NFL, they've sort of evened out, where I think you have that good mix of gut feeling or whatever you want to call it and your analytics. Like, okay, this is what the data is telling me that we should do. But in my experience, this is what I think we should do based off of all these different factors. And I think that right now with analytics in the NBA, would is it fair to say that they're still kind of in their infancy in how they're being used on a game to game basis? And I think we haven't gotten to that sweet spot yet where you have enough coaches who know how to coach the way that they have been instinctively, along with having the information of the data. Is that fair?
I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, the analytical minds are the ones in the front office making the decisions, not the ones coaching on the floor, trying to create team chemistry within the team. But what I always find interesting about analytics is that they'll make a team and a franchise look terrific in the regular season. And then when we get into the playoffs, and especially if they start advancing, they always hit a wall. And the wall is that chemistry piece, number one, the culture piece, number two, and the fact that, quite frankly, in the playoffs, you're kind of allowed to play defense. And you don't in the regular season. Like in absence of defense, analytics is going to win almost every time. But when you're allowed to actually be physical and kind of disrupt the things that analytics is telling you to do, the style that they're telling you to run, it's going to influence that. Like, say what you want about like I threw out the 2017 Warriors a little bit ago. Say what you want about that team, about it being loaded to pieces, and it was right, but they played defense. They played really good defense. That was evident not only through the regular season, but as they got into the playoffs. They're like, yeah, we can slow it down. We can make you pay. We got this. And that's where teams like the Celtics, both this year and last year, got into trouble. I would argue in this past series with the Heat that there wasn't much coaching strategy change on behalf of the Celtics coach. It was, well, I hope they get hot from three today. And they did for three games and then didn't when it mattered the most.
At the beginning of the season, I remember the Celtics were averaging like 120 points, but also giving up like 108. And I thought, well, that doesn't seem like a good recipe for success. I mean, you have to hope that you are averaging 109 points a game just to eke out the win. And 109 points objectively is a lot, no matter what era you're talking about. And even now, where teams are scoring in triple digits a lot, I mean that's like assuming okay, we have to score 109 just to get out the building, and that's a huge ask every single game, game in, game out. When guys get tired, the grind of being on the road, everything involved with every single game, that's where the coach has to step in. And we will get to that a little bit about my boy Joe Mazzulla and everything that he did and didn't do. But I want to ask you too about this season. I think that the parity at the top, or just in general in the league, was great. The Western Conference was seemingly wide open. The Eastern Conference seemed like it was a little bit more set in stone, at least at the top with the top two teams. But I think overall, this was one of the weird NBA years where we didn't really have a good gut feeling on what was going on. So I guess in that vein, what are some of the biggest surprises in this season that you didn't anticipate coming in?
Well, hilariously, parody was the top thing on my list. We're talking about surprises of like, as you said, outside of maybe some of the Eastern Conference favorites, there wasn't really any sort of favorite coming out of the West. Like Denver had been the best team in the West all season. Nobody felt like they were a favorite because they hadn't proved it yet. Vegas had the Lakers in better odds to win the title than it did Denver, which was just fathomable. But again, I think we also saw a lot of young teams make bigger leaps than we thought that they were ready for. Some of which came to bite them in the ass late in the season, like Memphis, but others like Cleveland that we were like, all right, they're probably going to be super good in maybe 1 2 years. They got good almost immediately with Mitchell. Yes, they struggled in the first round because they were inexperienced and it showed, right? And they unquestionably got out coached. A lot of younger teams, Sacramento, I think was one probably the biggest feel good story of the season. Like who would have saw that coming? And that was the best, to my mind, so far. The best playoff series we've had was Kings Warriors. That series was absolutely fun to watch. I think it's the only series where I've watched every game of because it was just too much fun to sit on the side of it. But even teams like my Magic coming in and out of nowhere. You had Utah that started the season strong. They faltered at the end. They came down to earth a little bit, but they said, "Hey, we actually have some promise here." And then you have the Thunder, who are going to be stupid, sneaky good, especially as they get Chet Holmgren next year. Like Thunder are going to be good. Like don't sleep on them either. I love the young competitiveness that's coming out of these younger teams.
Well, a lot of these teams were due, weren't they? I mean, the Sacramento Kings were due to have just a passable season, let alone the season that they had. I too like that because I know as a generalist in sports, I don't focus on one team in the NBA. I know that my pedigree would tell me that I should be a Boston Celtics fan, but I just haven't had that level of care for that team. And a lot of it comes from a lot of winning from two other teams in the region. And I think the Celtics, man, I hate to say this. I'm going to say this. I think they're the Dallas Cowboys of the NBA because
Ooh,
they feel relevant. They think that they're relevant, but they've had one title since the Celtics of the 80s, one. And that was with the first big three. Theoretically, they should have had more than one. I mean, that series against the Lakers, the second one, that was a rough way to go out. And then the big three took them out. LeBron took over the league, and that was it. Those teams were done. And so the Celtics have always felt to me like this team and this fan base that has a lot of bravado for wins that happened ages ago.
I think that's fair, and I would agree with that completely. Those fans don't have a. I mean, we've talked a lot about Boston fans as a whole, but they- they'll let you know how good they were. And yeah, I think I never would have considered that as like a Cowboys comparison. That's not a bad comparison of like, hey, you actually haven't been relevant for a couple of decades.
It might be more fair if Red Auerbach was still alive and was as old as like Jerry Jones. You know what I mean? Like that would be very similar dynamic, but I don't think you get that as much from like the front office. But let's think about something else now because we're going to get to the Celtics as we get to the playoffs, but I want to talk coaching. This is one of the more volatile coaching years that I've seen in a long time. Where, what is it, three or four guys that either made the playoffs this year or have won a title in the last 5 years are now jettisoned from their team. And I think for me, the least surprising was Doc Rivers getting fired. Is that fair?
Oh, 100%. Doc Rivers, I was talking with a buddy, and we were during that series, and we were saying that Doc Rivers looks like he's past his expiration date as a coach. Like he looks he seems like the guy who can take a team that has a lot of talent on it that is underperforming, get them to perform like a good team, but can't get them to become a great team. Like that's Doc Rivers. So like for example, if Doc Rivers took over, I don't know, Atlanta, the Hawks have some talent. He would turn them from like a I'm in the play in every year to like a hey, I'm like a anywhere from a 2 to a 4 seed, and they'll get bounced in the second round. That's not at all joking about him getting bounced in the second round for the last couple of years, but that's almost like that's his ceiling right now, and it's I don't know whether it's his style. I don't know whether it's the players. Like, did Doc Rivers fail the 76ers because they did get better every year and Embiid got better every year, or did the players let him down?
Yeah, and that's with Doc Rivers. Like you weren't taking a jab. I mean, he's lost 10 game sevens in his coaching career. That's a lot.
Yeah,
And
that is a
he's
lot.
blown more 3-1 series leads than like any coach in playoff history. None of those are good things, but yet he is the solid, stable guy. Coach on one of our episodes recently said he's a stabilizer, and he comes in, and even he used the Clippers as an example to an extent, did kind of stabilize them. Now the Celtics, they got two really great players to go along with Paul Pierce. So like he didn't really stabilize a whole lot. They just changed the paradigm of the NBA. I think that's pretty fair to say that. That like Danny Ainge changed it by making that super team, and then it's
With
kind of petered out a little bit.
with players that bought in. Like,
Yes.
don't forget that. Like
Yes.
that Celtic team, as much as like Paul Pierce is like one of my least favorite players in the history of ever, like and I'll say it every chance I get, that team fully bought in immediately. Like they're like, we know what this is. We know what we have to do. We're getting it done like now because this is our window is now. And to their credit, they did exactly that. So one could argue that all Doc Rivers had to do was say, "Hey guys, go that way, run that way, and you'll be fine." And they're like, "We got it," and that's all they had to do. And
Yep.
he hasn't had a team like that since.
No. But I agree that the 76ers did get better because, oh man, this is another hot take for me. Trust the process is done. Like, we need to stop the process. Theoretically, the process has worked because the 76ers are not the joke or the butt of the joke in the league anymore, but they haven't won a title. And at the end of the day, that's what you're here for. You're here to win a title. And I think just like Mike Budenholzer, you've got a generational talent. Now, Mike Budenholzer got fired. He won a title 2 years ago. So that poor guy is done. But like the 76ers haven't done anything. And I'm sorry, man. I'm going to take that stance. They haven't done a thing because if you don't win a title with Embiid, the whole experiment is a failure. Hard stop.
No, 100%. And Embiid fits the same mold of like those dominant centers that like were playing in the 90s. Like it's the same mold. He's just a little bit more maybe jump shooter ish and maybe slightly more frail. And that's not a knock to say that he's like weak. He's not. He's a big, strong dude. But you know, even you mentioned Budenholzer. Like if Giannis stays healthy and that doesn't get injured in that series, Budenholzer probably has a job because the Bucks are probably in the finals right now.
Yeah, that firing to me felt almost scapegoaty. And it was very much like a referendum on Giannis. And I don't understand this around the Bucks at all because this was a team Giannis needed to prove it. You know this. Every year we get a guy coming for the crown, right? Giannis is the next coming of whoever you want to say, right? A generational player. And there's a lot of generational players in the NBA right now. Like we have actually been really lucky to see guys that have transcended the league over the last 6, 7 years. And Giannis needed to get over that hump and he won a title. Generally, that buys you a lot. And for some reason, in a city that doesn't really have anything else, with a franchise that hasn't won anything before that, what was it, Kareem years in the 70s, right? And they have a title. And I get it. You lose to an 8 seed and that's never a good look. And Coach Bud didn't look very good in the playoffs, but we also found out that his brother died. So, how much of that is on him? And it seems like the easy thing to do is fire the coach. But as our coach on Iceman and Coach said, do they think they're going to get somebody in who's going to somehow magically turn it around? That's not any like that's somehow better than Mike Budenholzer. Like I just don't that one I don't get, and I don't get the Monty Williams one either.
100%. And to that point, the Bucks did hire somebody. They hired Adrian Griffin, right? Adrian Griffin, who has oodles of pedigree as an assistant, like Sam Cassell, Brian Shaw level of assistant coach pedigree. So super experienced, but he's getting his first gig as the head guy on the bench on a we are very ready to win now team. Like that's a tall order. I would have swore to you if you had asked me 3 weeks ago that they were going to hire Nick Nurse, who just got hired by Philly, or at worst Monty Williams, who somehow still doesn't have a job. I can't fathom that one right now, but he still doesn't have a job. That's a win now team that needs a coach that knows how to win now. Say what you want about Monty Williams. He was in the finals. He was probably 2 injuries away from at least taking the Nuggets to 7. Remember, they front loaded that Suns team, and then he lost 2 of those 4 front loaders. Like that's a big deal. No different than the way Budenholzer lost the front runner. Like I called them the Milwaukee Giannis's for a reason. Like if he goes down, they're screwed. No
Oh,
different than if Jokic goes down for Denver, they're screwed, like straight screwed.
man, I had that take on YouTube that the Denver Nuggets would be nowhere without Jokic, and somebody came at me and said, "What are you talking about? They're the most complete team in the league." And I'm like, "Get out! Like he is. They're not
Complete
there."
because of Jokic.
Yes, thank you.
They're
I'm glad
complete
somebody
because
who
of
knows
Jokic.
more. Yes, 100%. You cannot tell me that that team isn't where it is because of that 7'2" white guy who does things that nobody else in the league does. Like there's just, I'm sorry, you're not going to do that to me. Yeah, you YouTube guy who told me I was full of shit. Screw you, because I'm right.
Oh man, what a
Yes,
team! We'll get to that we'll get to that in a little bit. But
we certainly will.
like,
My new favorite man crush in the NBA. But as far as the coaching stuff, so Monty Williams still doesn't have a job. Now you could make the argument that the Suns players let him down because their losses weren't coaching. You might be able to say from a mental standpoint that getting blown out at home last year, maybe you can put that on the coach. But
yeah,
2 years ago in the finals, he was like the feel good story of the finals. And nope, gone. So like and they have an aging team now where they've got Durant and they've got Chris Paul, who's probably very, very close to out to pasture territory or veterans exception territory because he's hurt a
yep,
lot too. And so now Nick Nurse, right? Nick Nurse was, in my opinion, the casualty of this is just turnover to a whole new leaf for the Raptors because they got a mercenary in Kawhi Leonard, win the title. The pandemic happens, Kawhi leaves. Like nobody expects him to do anything. And it's almost like a pity firing for Nick Nurse. Like, go get a job somewhere else where your skills will probably be better suited. And I think that's a really good move for Philly because it's a guy who's won a title.
yep. It's the guy that's the guy that won a title and knows how to manage an aloof personality. Like let's just be honest. Kawhi's a great player. He's aloof. He's very, very aloof. Not like rude, not like just odd. NBA stars, the younger ones especially, are very odd people. Like they've got stars in any sport are odd just because you have to have a certain level of ego to be that successful. Like I get it, but there's like a certain level of weird. It's almost like that actor that gets so famous that they just have like they're just so weird in their personal life with some of their habits and some of like what they do, where they live, how they interact with people. It's similar to that because since the NBA stars have pretty substantial platforms, there's not necessarily a good. I don't know if the organizations have are well equipped to be able to help guide young men who have now been given just about everything into, hey, how do you actually like make the most of this and make the most of yourself, or at least try? And maybe they do, and they just don't listen because they have all these people blowing smoke up their ass.
Well, that's the thing is like younger people are motivated differently. And I just turned 40, so I don't consider myself a young person anymore. When a lot of these guys, Giannis and Joel Embiid, they're under 30 years old, right? So they're in their 20s. And it's just different now where I think today's player, Phil Jackson probably couldn't exist before he won a title in today's game because he doesn't come in with a pedigree. And I think that younger people, especially young superstars in the NBA, they trust guys that have been there and won something. And so that's why the Doc Rivers hiring made a lot of sense for the 76ers. You bring a guy in who obviously has stabilized things, he's won a title. And I think now Nick Nurse, like I said, gets jettisoned from Toronto. Thank goodness for him, right? He comes back to the land of paying maybe a little bit less taxes and gets to be with a team. I mean, he's gifted a team that is win ready right now. And they may even be a piece away from being elite because I don't know what's going to happen with Harden and all that good stuff, but they've got the centerpiece. Like they've got the most important part, the part that a lot of these teams were salivating over come lottery time. And I think that he's going to be a really, really good fit there. But my question is, where does Monty Williams end up? Do you think he ends up being an assistant somewhere and then gets a gig? Because I think that he'd be great for the Celtics.
It would be a good fit for the Celtics. That would break my heart personally if he did. He'd be a great he'd be a really great fit there. For as a sidebar for the listeners for a second, my two least favorite teams in the NBA are the Celtics and the Heat,
Yes.
and I've been privileged to watch such series for the last 3 or 4
Privilege.
years. So
Oh my
I'm a little
goodness.
salty, but you're right. He'd be a great fit. I think he's the guy. So like you mentioned Phil Jackson a second ago. So I'm actually reading 11 Rings by Phil Jackson right now, and the first we all know that Phil was a little odd in the sense of like some of his practices and whether like his religious studies and how he incorporated that into his coaching, his philosophies, his routine, his players, etc. And in the first chapter of his book, he talks about like how what he tried to do with his teams was foster a sense of love, not like amorous love or like almost like brotherhood, like military love. Like when you go into battle with someone, you're like, I could hate that guy, but he's my brother, and I'd take a bullet for him. That level of love, and that's what makes the team successful, which is a culture piece. That's why the Warriors have been relevant for so long, right? That's why they were derailed at the beginning of this season with the Draymond and Poole thing, because that messes with that stability and that balance and that culture, and that messes with that brotherly love.
What a weird way to start a season for a defending champion, by the way.
Yeah.
That was the
Yeah.
strangest thing I've ever seen. And yet it was the least surprising thing coming from the player that it came from. But it's just odd. It's like you just win the title. So, yeah, I'm going to punch my teammate in the face in practice. And I think we talked about the leak on that was wrong. But man, it's just, I think it's buy in. You talked about it. Maybe, just maybe. And I don't want to say this as throwing Joel Embiid under the bus, but maybe Joel Embiid is just not bought in the way that he thinks that he's bought in. And maybe that's the way that players are today. That less players are as bought in. Like I would make the argument that those 90s Knicks teams with John Starks and Oak, I mean, those teams were bought in. They wanted to beat the Bulls, like super bought in. The Pacers back in the day, all those teams, the Jazz bought in, like ready to go. Maybe teams today aren't as bought in at the top. And maybe that's why you get some of these superstars that fail their coaches because they're not 100% in and they're almost waiting for that coach to to almost convince them that yeah, you can be bought in now. Maybe.
Well, that's been the critique of Harden for what, a decade. That when it matters, he's not bought in. As great of a talent as he is that he's not bought in, and that's Embiid's co-star. When you're younger, don't necessarily have, unless you come out with it automatically, you don't have that screw you, I'm going to succeed no matter what kind of mentality, because stars today, especially the young ones, are so coddled and protected. I mean, I think that that is a large reason in Philadelphia of what broke Ben Simmons, of that same sort of philosophy of like, I'm I'm coddled for so long, and then when it's like, no, let's chips are down, we got to do this, folds, because it's not there. And that same thing with Harden in every elimination game that I feel like he's played in the last decade, going back even to his days in Houston, where it's like it's on the line, and he'll have moments. He had moments in, what is it, game 4 or game 5 of the Celtics series where he was literally carrying that team and was like, when it was hitting the huge shots down the stretch. I think he hit the shot to win the game. And then in game 7 just blew it up. Like, I mean, you're like, what are you doing? And it brings all that comparisons of like, do they have that drive? And did they ever have someone on the team that helped foster that? Like, I feel like only the teams that care about culture, like, there's a reason Udonis Haslam's been on the Heat for like 25 years or whatever, however long he's been on the team. It's a it's a presence, it's an accountability person. It's a person that says, "Hey, I've been there for all of this. I know what it takes to win, and I'm going to keep you honest to that because that's what we do here." And there's not a dude like that in Philly. They had one. His name was Jimmy. They lost to the Raptors in one of the most ridiculous game-winning shots in the history of ever. Like, but that was Philly's best shot to win the title. Was that year right there when they had Jimmy, because that's Jimmy, which he's proven the last three, even going back to the bubble postseasons. Like, he's shown that that's who he is. And in absence of a guy like that, you get Embiid. Hopefully not forever. I hope he figures it out. He's too good of a player to not figure it out. But maybe he does need that coach, and maybe Nick Nurse can do that. You know, hopefully Nick Nurse doesn't turn him into Pascal Siakam.
Maybe the Magic will get an old, aging, grumpy Joel Embiid to sit in the post as they make their run toward the Eastern Conference Finals in 2027. You never know. But we've talked a lot about these coaches and everything, and I think what it represents is a turnover in the franchise, right? You either have franchises that are in win now mode, and so they're trying to get the right pieces in place to win. But last week or 2 weeks ago, we had the draft lottery, which is the opposite of that. And it's a lot of teams who are hoping to literally win a lottery to change their fortune. Now, this year was a lot different because we had what many people consider, it might even be unanimous, as a can't miss prospect. And I'm going to say it. Let me see if I can get it right. Victor Wembanyama. Yes.
Yeah,
Excellent.
yeah.
Okay. So Wemby, as we're going to call him from now on, because that's way easier, is the prize that everybody wants to win. Now, the NBA is very unique in the fact that they have a draft lottery. So tanking is decentivized by doing this. And I think that that's a good thing. But yet, at the same time, when your team stinks because they're objectively stinky, then you don't necessarily get the prize at the end of the tunnel the way that you would in other sports. So I want to ask you first about the lottery in general. I like it, but I know a lot of casual fans don't like it. What are your thoughts on it for the NBA specifically?
It's gotten better over the years. I think that the percentages now give people enough of a reasonable fair chance to where you don't have to tank. I mean, like, again, as I mentioned earlier, I'll use the Magic as an example. The Magic were eliminated from the play-in in game 78 of 82 and had the fifth best odds of getting the number one pick. That's a big deal. And for me, I think that the lottery helps with that incentivization of tanking, especially since they've restructured it. Like, the best percentage you have is 14%, whereas in previous years that could be as high as like 20 something. The fact that it's a little more open has made it better. Plus, again, the teams are being more incentivized to actually succeed on the other side, which I think has been better. So you're not seeing the same teams as often in the lottery, with exception to maybe Detroit. I'm sorry, Detroit fans. Um, but hopefully, like, maybe they can get out of it. I mean, Detroit's a non-injury to Cade Cunningham away to being a somewhat exciting, decent team.
So the San Antonio Spurs end up getting the first pick in the draft, and I had flashbacks to 1997 with Tim Duncan and the Boston Celtics. Remember those Patino years we talked about? And
Yeah,
that was a franchise changing moment for the Celtics because I know that they were really bad that year and that probably would have changed their fortune. So Wemby is going to go to the Spurs. Now, I find this fascinating because they have a coach who obviously he already might be in the Hall of Fame, but if he wasn't, he was going to walk in regardless. And we think he's out the door, or at least he's thinking about it. But yet at the same time, Pop seems like the perfect guy to have a dude like Wemby come over from France, come into the league, and nurture him in so that somebody else who's younger and is in the pedigree of Pop can take over the team when they are ready to go. And I think that it works out, but I want to get your thoughts on the situation because it seems pretty positive for him.
100%. And for the record, Pop is going in this year.
Okay, yeah, I knew it was soon because I know that he has been a curmudgeon and not wanted it, but I think you
Yeah,
said last year or on a recent
he,
episode that because he's accepting it, he's got to be at least thinking about retiring.
yeah. I mean, I think he's the oldest coach in the NBA. Stop me if I'm wrong on that. He's got to be close if he isn't. He has the pedigree of coaching Hall of Fame big men. Obviously, he had Duncan. He also had Robinson, David Robinson. Granted, Robinson was established at that point, but still, I would call out what I think is not often discussed is that those two guys were very different personalities from Wembanyama, byproduct of different eras. But Popovich also has experience of ingratiating stars from other countries and making them feel at home, accepted, even in a place like San Antonio, which isn't necessarily when you're in France, you're like, I want to go to San Antonio. But like he has that pedigree and he's got the knowledge to be able to at least create the foundation since we don't think that Pop will be his coach long term. It's a great fit for him. But I will say this, and I'm directly talking to ESPN here. Can they calm down a little bit with the Wembanyama potential? We get that he's the clear consensus number one favorite. We get that he will probably be a very good player for a very long time. We get it. But leading up to it, guys like Woj were like, hey, this is the greatest prospect ever. And not only was he saying that for basketball, but he was taking that to any sport. Let's just take basketball here, for example. Like, let me ask you this coming right off the bat, knowing that he's on a not good team and he's going to probably be the number one option immediately, which is fair. Give me a Wembanyama stat line for next year. What's he gonna do?
Oh, I don't think it's going to be what people think it. It's not going to be Jokic. Remember, Jokic was drafted what in 2013 or 2014, and it took him how many years to become what he is today? So probably a very pedestrian stat line, as Cleve would always say. Do it in the NBA, and I also do not buy into this hype ahead of time. I think it's fair to look at a prospect and say this is can't miss. Can't miss prospect is one thing, but what happens when they get to the league is another thing. Because how many guys have we seen come through that have been high lottery picks that have been can't miss and they missed? Not because their coaches let them down or the organization let them down, but because they let themselves down. I mean, in some cases, you have one on the Orlando Magic right now who was seen as a part of the process, and now he's in Orlando Magic. So it's not his fault or necessarily the organization's fault, but that's a good example of a lot of hype doesn't buy you anything.
The last player with this kind of hype was LeBron. Like, and I think that's a fair assessment to say. LeBron was hyped for like when he was a junior and high school coming to the NBA. LeBron's rookie season, 21, 5 and 6. Cavs missed the playoffs. So like, even if you keep backing it up, like probably before that, maybe the '96 draft class had a lot of the can't miss. Like Iverson was 20 plus a game. Sixers weren't. Shaq in '92, 23, 14, and 3 blocks. Magic went from a 20-win team to 500. Like that's good. MJ walking off the bus in '84 with 28, 6 and 6. Like Bird and Magic in '79, immediately good and immediately successful. And of course, the big one, well, the two big ones really, this is where particularly the one that frustrated me the most when talking about Wembanyama's potential is like walk up to Woj and be like, dude, let me introduce you to this fellow named Kareem. Kareem, who between high school and college lost like 2 games in like 4 years, and then came into the NBA on an expansion team and made them a playoff team immediately with a pedestrian 29 and 14.
I
Right?
mean, those are like Jokic numbers. And I
Yeah,
say that as in like there is something to be said about that. But I agree. The hype needs to stop. And I think we'll get to that. So he's going to go to the Spurs unless the
yeah.
Spurs pull the coup of the century and trade it away for what has to be like every first round pick from now until the end of the decade. But I think he's going to be in San Antonio. He's going to hate it there. France is obviously a little bit different than
They did have
Texas.
Tony Parker. Tony
Yes, he did.
Parker can help incorporate that for him there.
Yeah, and that is an aspect I hadn't thought about. So I want to get into the playoffs and the finals now. So I'm going to ask you to do something for me. So we have the playoffs. I want you to give me, the viewers, and the listeners your top three likes and dislikes from this playoff year.
All right. We're going to start with likes. Top three likes is Denver being Denver. For those of you guys who don't watch games in Mountain Time, I've had the pleasure. I travel a lot for a living, and one of the stops I've been through a couple times is Denver. I've had a chance to see this team play. The team's really good. Jokic is phenomenal. I hope that now the national audience gets to now fully appreciate how good he is and how well they've built the team around him. Not in absence of him. The non-Jokic minutes are awful when he's not on the floor, unless Murray's on stupid fire, which he has been so far in the playoffs, which is probably why they're here. But Denver is so good and so much fun. Like that's offense the way it's supposed to be played, and it reminds me of '80s basketball. To be quite honest with you, it really does. Second, like was I mentioned it earlier, Kings Warriors was phenomenal. Like that's a playoff series. That's everything I want in a playoff series. Every game was good. Every game was close. Both teams taking throat punches. A young team saying we are going to go the distance. Yeah, they struggled right there in a little bit at the end of game 7. We got you. That's the experience of the Warriors being like, this is how you win. And the Kings are going to come back next year and be like, we got you. And I think the Kings are going to be really good. And I hope I get another Kings Warriors series like that again. And then the third thing, and this is speaks a little bit to the where we're at in the finals, the reemergence of the role player in the national narrative. Like, hello, name anyone on the Heat not named Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo prior
Duncan
to this
Robinson,
playoffs, right? Prior to the playoffs. Name anyone on the Nuggets besides Jokic and Murray prior to the playoffs. Like
no chance.
it's is that is we talk about heat culture a lot. Like that's culture is when you surround it with the right group of people who fill their role to the T, and that's what makes great teams. Like, yeah, you could make the argument the Heat are getting kind of lucky, but their role players are filling their roles super well. Every human being on the Nuggets around Jokic fills their role to the T, and that's why it's successful. They've always been there. They've always been needed to get to this point, but they don't get the credit. But they have been in this playoffs. We all know that stars are important and they're the ones that drive to the title. It's always been like that. It will always be like that, with a couple of super rare, notable exceptions. But I've loved to see the role players getting a little bit of the limelight again. It's been awesome.
So now the bad news.
Oh boy. Biggest disappointment, we've touched on this briefly already, injuries, playoff injuries. The Bucks would probably be in the NBA Finals. I don't think that's a stretch to say. The Nuggets and Suns would have at least gone to 7 with a healthy CP3 and Aiton. Who knows what the hell the Clippers would have done with Kawhi and PG on the floor? Literally the two best players. And then Memphis with Brandon Clark and especially Steven Adams, not just from size, but also from a maturity standpoint, like these singular adults on the team, um, being hurt against a Laker team that thrived on size. Like Anthony Davis destroyed them for the whole series. Like the playoffs could have been so much different had those teams been healthier. So that's a little bit of a disappointment, which translates me to the Memphis Grizzlies being its own set of disappointments, right? Immaturity at its full display without and like I feel like this is modern immaturity, right? There's immaturity of being like, okay, I just need to grow up. Then there's immaturity of like, I'm not going to be responsible for my actions at the same time. Like that's this team, and they're getting bitten in the ass every opportunity that karma says, "Yep, it's yours. Take this and learn from it, or don't." But if you don't, this is the maximum that you're ever going to be, which is sad because a year ago, Memphis was fun. Memphis was the Kings a year ago. They were young. They talk shit. They're like, "We're coming." Great. We thought they were coming this year. but they haven't grown up yet. And I hope that they do. And I hope that they stabilize the off court distractions so they can be better on court. And my God, please get another veteran on the team. Like,
Yes,
dear
please.
God, get another veteran on that team. They need it. Clearly, they need an adult in the room.
Specifically, one that doesn't look like a pirate and or Jason Momoa. Please, that's all I'm asking.
Steven Adams is one of like the most high quality human beings in the NBA.
Oh, I
He's
know.
such a nice human being.
He looks like a pirate.
I love it. And then lastly, and this is especially prevalent, I think, from the Heat Celtics series. I think this is one of the greatest display. Is just the constant replay reviews and coach challenges lengthening the game. Like, flow of the game is important. Like, what the hell is a flagrant foul anymore? Like, can someone explain to me a flagrant foul? Like, they probably stopped like the last two games between the Celtics and Heat 15 times to look at, was that a flagrant? It's a basketball play. He got hit in the head on accident. I get it. It's not flagrant foul. Like,
Flagrant
flagrant foul is if I'm like trying to like punch you in the head.
I was gonna say flagrant fouls to me, like if I were to show a hard foul to my wife, she'd be like, "Oh, whoa, that was out of bounds," and I'd be like, "Okay, that's a flagrant foul." Somebody who doesn't know anything says, "Ooh, that's a
Yep.
little weird." That's the way flagrants have always been to me, like super obvious. I'm like, "Oh, he went out of his way to be an ass right there."
Yeah.
And now, yes, but the reason I was laughing when you said replays because do you recall maybe 2 years ago, 2 summers ago, when you had a great rant about coaches' challenges in the G League or the Summer League. Do you remember this? Because,
Oh yeah. It
yes,
drove me insane. And then like now, like it's becoming worse, and I hate it every time I see it now. Like, it'll be the second quarter of a game. It'll be like a questionable out of bounds call, and the players can swirl the hand, do the replay, coach, have my back. And I'm like, it's the second quarter of game seven. Coach ain't challenging that at all. Like, what's wrong with you? And then later in the game, when it's like 30 seconds left in the game, and then something happens, you're like, no, coach, challenge it. It's like, I used it in the second quarter. Like, can't do that anymore. So
oh,
like,
that's
just stop the hand thing. We You can disagree with it without trying to make a show out of it. We get it. Like, stop telling the coach to replays to challenge it in the second quarter. Like, it's dumb.
you are aging precipitously as you have been doing podcasting with us because that is going to
Old
get
man,
the
get off my
okay.
lawn.
That is going to get the okay boomer treatment when I post. That is a
Oh,
short, no
100%.
doubt, and I'm so here for it. But storylines heading in. I think outside of the I think these storylines are Jokic cementing his legacy with a ring and Jimmy Butler getting validation. That's the word I'm using for Jimmy Butler because I think he has been an elite player for a long time. He's gotten the bad teammate nod with everything that happened in Minnesota. And obviously the 76ers, he ends up leaving, goes to the Heat. But he has been, as a lot of people in South Florida are calling him Himmy Butler, the last few years, and it would be validation for him to get a ring, especially within that organization. He wins a ring in that organization. He's now a Heat lifer. It doesn't matter what happened prior to. He's a Heat lifer. But I want to ask you, though, outside of those two players, who are some of the most important non superstar players that each team is going to need?
Touched on it a little bit already, talking about Jamal Murray, how so much of the focus has been on whether he's going to be bubble Murray or non-bubble Murray. 'Cause bubble Murray was like unconsciously hot. Jeremy Lin for 2 weeks, Linsanity kind of hot, right? Like, couldn't do any wrong. Like, walked on water for 2 weeks. Like, couldn't do anything wrong. And this Jamal Murray in these playoffs, in a sense, like, to a smaller degree, like Jimmy Butler is trying to find his own sense of validation of like, hey, this is actually me and I actually belong. And he's playing similar to Bubble Murray. And if he continues to do that, they have a really, really good shot. All Denver has to do is just continue to move and Jokic find them. Like, that's how easy is that as offense, right? But the Nuggets, whether they're most vulnerable and where you know that Spolstra, who's by far the best coach still remaining in the playoffs, no offense to Mike Malone, Spo is a far superior coach than most coaches in the league and has been here before. Spo is going to capitalize on the non-Jokic minutes, like 100% going to capitalize on the non-Jokic minutes. So it's, what do you do when he's off the floor? That's going to be what wins Denver the series. Is how they handle if they can survive with Jokic off the floor. because when he's on the floor, I don't think the Heat can beat him. For the Heat might be getting Tyler Hero back. Tyler Hero is cleared for all basketball activities. Hasn't played, I think, the last towards since I think near the end of the regular season with his hand injury. Tyler Hero is a 20-point per game scorer. The Heat are literally the lowest scoring team in the NBA. They could use a little bit of offense, but what I what this reminds me of a little bit is how in 2009 when the Magic were in the finals, of course everything reminds me of the Magic, but when the Magic were in the finals, rode all the way to the finals with Rafer Alston as the point guard because the starting point guard, who was an all star that year, and Jameer Nelson was injured. Jameer Nelson comes back in the finals and disrupts that flow. And that was super impactful in that series because every all the bit of the Magic's mojo and flow, and we analyze that series for another time, it was disruptive. And it's you now have with the Heat, you have Caleb Martin, who's played a couple series of really solid basketball. Max Strus has played well. Gabe Vincent's played well, and Gabe Vincent, I know, is a point guard, but Hero would take some of those minutes. And Gabe Vincent has had a little bit of injury problems with his foot last couple of games. And are you going to insert Hero with his big contract and his Jordan Poole like tendencies into the lineup, or are you going to continue to let this flow go because the flow is working?
It's a good question. And we're going to find out on June 1st when this tips off. Now, I want to put you on the spot. I need you to give me a prediction for the NBA Finals.
I'm going Nuggets in five. I
Wow.
know that seems short.
Wow.
Um,
I thought you were going to say Heat and 7 and I was going to just end the broadcast right now.
the the Nuggets are rested for one. They don't have nagging injuries right now because of that rest. The Heat do. They've been by far the best offense in the playoffs, by far. In the same way that the Heat were able to kind of disrupt the Celtics' constant take 400 threes a game. To disrupt the Nuggets is to disrupt Jokic. And the only way that you disrupt Jokic is to like kick him in the groin or something.
I was going to say,
So
is there a way to
like
do that?
I don't see anyone slowing it down. The Lakers were playing phenomenal defense the first two series and got obliterated by the Nuggets. Like just obliterated. Like, yes, game four was close, but like they ended up winning the game. Nuggets won the game anyway. Where the Heat have the biggest advantage in the series is Spo. Like by far, it's Coach Spolstra. That'll win them a game. Jimmy Butler will probably win him a game. Jimmy Butler might win him two. It might be Nuggets in six. I don't see a way, barring a Jokic injury, I don't see a way where the Nuggets lose this series.
Well, they have it, folks. And I would actually tend to agree because I think Jokic is unprecedented, but all of his stats are just his average, which is insane. Like when I texted you and asked, does he really have 13 rebounds in the first quarter? And that was his stat line. Like it's that unbelievable. And the thing is he does it game in, game out. And even he had a pedestrian stat line, which was like a Kareem stat line. It was what, like 25 and 12? And Murray went off for like 37. So they're tough.
People, every time I give this comparison, people push back, but hear me out for a second. Like watching Jokic reminds me of like all of the footage I've seen of watching Larry Bird. In that, Larry Bird being the most unassuming player probably ever, he walks off the floor with 26, 10, and 7. And you're like, how the hell did he get 26, 10, and 7? And it's the same thing with Jokic. He just walks off the floor and you're like, how the hell did he get 25, 15, and 10? Like, where did that come from? It's just casual. It's part of the flow of the offense. That's why the Nuggets are so good. Jokic's usage rate is like 1/3 of Luka Doncic's, but you wouldn't know it if you watch the Nuggets. Like they integrate it as part of the offense, whereas everything with the Mavericks starts and ends with Luka and has to. But the Nuggets figured out how to get that same level of productivity out of a guy that touches the ball 1/3 less of the time. That's amazing. Jokic should have been MVP. I'll maintain that they just didn't want the narrative of putting him in the category of having three in a row because that puts him in very rare territory. I get it. Not that Embiid wasn't deserving of said MVP. He had an MVP caliber season. I think Jokic is just parading the fact that, yeah, I probably should have won MVP. Maybe Jokic has a little MJ in him, took personal.
Maybe he did, but I'm laughing because you said Larry Bird was unassuming, and that is said by somebody who can't have watched Winning Time. Because let me tell you what, he is not unassuming the way that they have portrayed him in Winning Time, which I know is
I love it.
completely fictitious in its approach. But man, we are reaching the end of this. It's gone by fast. And in each of these little sub shows, I like to do something special, give the shine to one of the guests on the show. And this time, I mean, I jokingly call you a professor of basketball, but as anybody who has listened or watched this has heard, you have a lot of knowledge. And so I want to open the floor like a professor. I want you to give us and the listeners and viewers a lecture, something that you think that we should know, that you are passionate about anything related to the NBA. Sir, the chalkboard is yours.
I want to use this time as a PSA for fan etiquette inside of sporting events. Like the last handful of years, we've gotten a lot of examples of fans crossing over lines that they probably shouldn't at sporting events. I was at a game earlier this year in Minnesota where the Magic were visiting the Timberwolves. And as a Magic fan, I was like, oh, cool. I'd never get a chance to see them on the road. I'm going to go. And during the game, there was a fight on the court between some of the players, and the uh, well inebriated Timberwolf fan behind me decided that he was going to blame me for the entire fiasco of the Magic, wearing a Magic hat in front of him, and wanted to try and fight me over it, despite the fact that I hadn't said a word to him all game. Things like that. There's plenty of stories of players talking about like some of the racial stuff that fans will say to them in the crowd. Um, there was the guy that tried to spit on Trey Young a couple of years ago in the playoff game. Like, even going to a Magic Heat game when the Heat fans chanting "F Orlando" throughout the court towards the end of the game. Like, come on, like players and people are human too. Egging them on in a competitive way is fine. They many of them like that. Like when you're talking about like, oh, you're not gonna hit this free throw, and then they make free throws. Told you so, right? Like they like that stuff, right? But don't make it personal. Don't be disrespectful to the player. Don't be disrespectful to the person. Keep it classy. Like stay competitive, but don't cross that line.
That is a great PSA for all you fans out there. But before we end this episode, I just want to remind everybody, if you have an opinion on anything that we have said on any Iceman and Coach entity, do not forget to call or text the show. The number for that is area code 703-718-6314. I'll repeat that one more time. Area code 703-718-6314. Call, text, give us your opinion, your hot take. Who knows? Maybe we will actually put it on the show. Don't forget to support Iceman and Coach every single week. The main show happens every single week, and we have all these offshoots. If you are watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so that you know when all these episodes are coming out. If you listen in the podcasting space, you can find all of these subscribe links below in the show notes. And I want to remind you as well, support the Pub Time podcast because that's where the coach does some other work in the podcasting space. He has a lot of fun there. If you want to find the show on Instagram or Twitter, at Iceman and Coach is the handle to do that. And always, always, always do not forget to support the Matty Ice Media Network as a whole, mattyicemedia.com, where you can find the other podcasts like this, like Political Football, The Manual, and Fire Footwear. Matt, it has been excellent to have you on here. Do you have any parting thoughts outside of your lecture for our loyal viewers and listeners?
Nuggets in five, baby.
Well, there you have it, folks. Nuggets in 5. You heard it here first. The professor has spoken. I hope that this finds you well. I hope that this finds you safe. And for everybody here, this is Basketball U.